Okay, year 4. So this is the very last reading lesson on Friday the 12th of February of Fintan the Fedora, the world's worst explorer. Now let's find out what happens. What's going to happen when Corentina and Anna find out about the Choco Plum? What's going to happen to Mr. Wrench and Giganti Foods? And what's going to happen to Fintan? Is he going to get back with the last surviving Choco Plum? Is his family going to think he's a great explorer and a hero? Well, let's find out. Chapter 28. It was late afternoon by the time Gonzales and a few of the other men found Wrench and were puzzled as to why he should be lying flat on his back by an empty iron cooking pot. They revived him with a little water, patched up the nasty cut on his head, and escorted him back to the burnt remains of their camp. By the time he was lucid enough to speak, it became clear that Wrench had no idea what had happened either. All he could remember was that he was going on a lovely vacation to Brazil and kept asking where Barbara was. He had no memory at all of the Choco Plum mission or of the explosions which had destroyed it. Everything was a blank. Gonzales decided he should probably take command. He picked up Wrench's satellite phone and called the emergency services to ask for help. It turned out that the local authorities were already extremely busy. Apparently they were overstretched due to a major manhunt. Most of their resources were tied up looking for the vicious hot dog van thieves. Gonzales decided to mention that among his party was his boss, Senor Wrench, who was seriously injured. Just in case it might help, he added that Senor Wrench was very rich and would be very grateful. It helped. The woman on the phone couldn't write their map coordinates down quickly enough. Within an hour, help was on its way. A huge police rescue helicopter with a paramedic on board was hurriedly dispatched out over the jungle looking for a clearing full of burnt rubble and 22 hopelessly lost men. Gribbly, on the other hand, knew exactly where he was and where he was going. He was going home. Spurred on by this tantalising prospect, he and Fintan, without the heavy cooking pot, had made good progress. According to the map, they could expect to reach the river before nightfall. Everything was going according to plan for a change. After what they hoped would be a good night's sleep on the riverbank, they planned to take Anna's boat back upstream the following day. Quite how they were going to paddle it against the current was something Gribbly was trying not to think about. It hadn't yet occurred to Fintan. For the rest of the day they pressed on through the dense forest, putting up with its now familiar hardships. There was the usual stifling heat to deal with, and the added difficulty of having to collect rainwater to drink. There was the humidity, more torrential rain, the mud, and the constant danger of falling branches, which would drop unexpectedly from the canopy above. There was also the awkward moment when Fintan pulled down a springy branch, let it go, and launched a long stripy snake which wrapped itself around Gribbly's neck like a scarf. But worst of all was the hunger. By evening, Fintan's stomach was making regular gurgling noises, loud enough to startle parrots. He had politely declined to try any of the little snacks Gribbly had plucked from the trees, and was feeling horribly weak. Not weak enough to eat insects yet, but horribly weak all the same. The relief he felt when they eventually reached the river was enormous. They had even managed to arrive before sunset, which meant they could still see to pitch their camp. "Well done, sir," commanded Gribbly as Fintan dropped his pack and lay in a heap on the ground. "We've done a good day's walking, even though I say so myself." Fintan forced a weary smile, but couldn't muster any conversation. Gribbly had a quick scout around in case he'd confused their location somehow, but he was confident it was the same spot where they had arrived a few days earlier. A large, clear, muddy area with virtually no trees, which meant they could see the sky for a change. There were the same tall pink rocks split by a cascading waterfall, the same merging of rivers, and the same turbulent brown water. The only difference was that the river level had risen considerably, probably because of all the rain, and their boat had gone. This was bad. With an unpleasantly cold feeling of doom growing in his stomach, he frantically double-checked the area and even looked up the trees, but it had definitely gone, floated away in the high water. This wasn't going to be easy news to break. "What?" said Fintan when he eventually realised Gribbly wasn't joking. "Gone? But how did it... What are we going to do now? A painful silence followed. This was a question that neither of them could answer. Die was the only obvious word they could come up with, and neither of them wanted to say it. With heavy legs and even heavier hearts, they tied their hammocks in silence and prepared for the fast approaching night. Gribbly couldn't even bring himself to gather a crunchy little supper. This was a new low point. They sat side by side on a log for a while and miserably shared a tiny square of soapy peanut butter sandwich. Neither of them spoke, each quietly contemplating the dire new situation they found themselves in. They may have made it to the Choco Plum Grove and got something to show for it, but their chances of getting home alive had suddenly got a lot slimmer. As had Finton's stomach, which gurgled in protest as it diminished rations. Gribbs, said Finton after a while, if we do manage to get out of here, you know, if we get home, okay, will you remind me to write a letter to Corentina and Anna? I think I ought to apologise. I mean, we've lost the boat now, as well as the Choco Plum Grove. They're not going to be very happy with me. Gribbly managed to force a fairly positive-sounding tone. Of course, sir. As soon as we're home, I'll remind you to write. Thanks, Grib, old mate, said Finton listlessly. Shame, really, it's all ended up a bit of a mess, hasn't it? Hardly any food left, no boat, no way home. Still, at least things can't get any worse. Approximately 4 hours later, things got worse. Finton, tossing from side to side in restless sleep, began dreaming of food. Irresistibly tempting visions floated before him, vast mountains of mashed potato with sausages sticking out of them and floods of ketchup dripping down the sides, big bagfuls of fat, greasy chips smelling of vinegar, slabs of fruit and cake as big as house bricks, steaming hot chocolate, puddings drowning in gallons of chocolate sauce, whole jars of peanut butter dolloped onto thick, crusty white bread. He was suffering from the dreaded night starvation. Without knowing what he was doing, Finton began sleep-eating. Just before dawn, he awoke feeling a lot less hungry than when he went to sleep, and with his hand in an empty plastic container, "Oh no," he yelled, startling Gribbly awake. "Oh no, what have I done?" As far as Gribbly was concerned, it wasn't such a terrible thing. Finton had been welcome to the emergency soapy sandwich. It wasn't all that important, really, in the scheme of things. They were probably going to starve anyway. The only thing he found annoying was having to listen to his endless stream of abject apologies. "Oh, Gribbs, I'm so sorry," wailed Finton. Please believe me. I didn't mean to do it. We were going to share the last sandwich and I ate the lot. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. I was asleep. Please forgive me." Gribbly gritted his teeth. It was possible that he only had a short while left to live, and he didn't really want to spend his last few hours on earth listening to this irritating racket. "Master Finton, sir," he said with uncharacteristic abruptness, "will you kindly shut up, please?" Chapter 29. Eric and Edith Bumstead had, as usual, spent the night hungry, thirsty, lost, and lying uncomfortably on the ground, being bitten by insects. This particular night, though, they had, for some reason, been bitten a lot less than normal. It was either because they had slept on some warm pink rocks by the bank of the river, or more likely because they smelled so hideous by this stage that even the mosquitoes were avoiding them. Eric was just contemplating whether he could be bothered to sit up and face another day, when he thought he heard a voice. It was someone telling someone to shut up, only for once it wasn't his mother speaking. It was a man, unless, of course, he was imagining it. After wandering around in the jungle for several days in the company of his offensively sharp-tongued mother and living off bugs, berries and nuts, he had begun imagining all sorts of things. The firework display had been weird enough, but it had got worse. More than once he'd thought he'd heard seagulls or possibly penguins, neither of which were very likely in the rainforest. The previous afternoon he'd even seen a pink ice cream van parked under a tree. This voice, however, had sounded very real and very close by. He forced his grubby, sun-blistered eyes open, got to his feet and looked around. Less than 100 yards away on the edge of the clearing, there were 2 hammocks suspended from the trees, and standing next to the hammocks were 2 very familiar-looking people who appeared to be involved in some sort of argument. "Mum," he said, shaking her roughly by the shoulder. "Mum, wake up! You're not going to believe this!" "Well, there's no need to be rude," moaned Finton miserably. "I was only trying to be nice." Gribbly let out a sigh and apologised. "I'm sorry too, Master Finton. I'm afraid our difficult situation is causing us both to feel a little a little tense. Tempers are bound to... At this point, Gribbly forgot the rest of his sentence and stared over Finton's shoulder at an unexpected sight. There were two terrifying-looking wild-haired figures charging up behind him with their teeth bared and their arms flailing. Mute with shock, he pointed weakly in their direction. Finton turned around just in time to be knocked flat on his back by the shorter, fatter one of the wild people. He hit the ground heavily and had all the wind knocked out of him. The other assailant, who appeared to be a bony old woman with foul teeth and broken glasses, stopped running and brandished a big stick. Gribbly stepped back, partly in fright and partly revolted by the appalling smell wafting from their ragged attackers. They smelled like a dustbin full of rotten meat which had been left in the sun all day and garnished with goat's poo. He wasn't even sure whether to feel terrified or just sick. "I got him, Mum, look, I finally got him," hollered the fat man, pinning Finton to the ground. He seemed ecstatically pleased with himself. I got him! The woman with the stick bared her horrible brown teeth and cackled with delight. "Yes," she shrieked triumphantly, "he's ours at last!" "What are you doing?" stammered Finton beneath the foul-smelling, sweaty lump that was holding him down. "Get off me, will you? You smell terrible." "Yeah, well, you don't smell so great yourself, boy," sniggered Eric, enjoying his moment of victory. Gribbly stepped forward and tried to intervene, but was walloped round the shoulder by Edith's stick. "Stay back, you!" she yelled. "There's nothing to do with you, it's him we want." "Yeah," added Eric, right into Finton's face. "And we've got him too. I've been looking forward to this moment for so long. You'll not be giving us any more trouble now, will you, Fedora?" Finton, who was already hopelessly confused by the sudden turn of events and happily oblivious to the entire kidnap plot, was taken aback. "What are you talking about?" he said, trying to avoid the man's appallingly bad breath. "How do you know my name? I've never seen you before in my life." This wasn't entirely true, but then again the Bumsteads were a lot scruffier now, and when he'd briefly glimpsed them back at the airport... "Oh, yeah," said Edith. Don't come the innocent with us, boy. We've had more than enough of you and your tricks, but you're ours now, and so's your rich old daddy's money. You're well and truly kidnapped." "I beg your pardon," said Gribbly, thinking these unpleasant idiots must be suffering from the advanced stages of heat stroke. "Did you just say kidnapped?" "You heard correct, Mr. Cleverclogs," grinned Edith, "and we came all the way from England for this." Gribbly found this a little hard to believe. "Really? But why would you do that?" he asked, genuinely confused. "I don't understand. Why on earth would you come all the way to Brazil to kidnap him? Wouldn't it have made more sense to kidnap him in England? That's where he lives." "That's enough of your lip, Mr. Toffee-Nose," sneered Edith, swiping at him with her stick again, but missing. Gribbly continued anyway. "Seriously, though," he said, "I'm intrigued. How are you intending to send his family the ransom demand? Have you got a satellite phone? Is there a post box in the rainforest somewhere? Or are you planning on carrying him through the jungle and all the way back to England?" Gradually, Eric's victorious grin began to falter, as did his furious grip on Finton's shoulder. "Shut up!" he yelled without actually looking up. "Shut up, will you?" To Edith's amazement, her large lumpy son suddenly let go of their highly valuable prisoner and allowed him to scramble over the safety of his butler. She was stunned. "What are you doing?" she shouted. "Why did you let him go for, you idiot? He'll get away." "Yeah, well, so what if he does, Mother? What's the point anyway?" wailed Eric, who was now kneeling dejectedly on the muddy riverbank. "The posh bloke's right, isn't he? What are we supposed to do with him, eh? We're not kidnappers, we're rubbish, we're failures." It had taken several days to happen, but it seemed Eric was finally coming to what remained of his senses. They'd been fooling themselves. It was all pointless. He slumped even further down into the mud and burst into a sudden flood of tears. "Stop that, Eric!" hollered his unsympathetic mother. Get up this minute, you useless lump." Finton and Gribbly took advantage of this development to take a few more paces backwards towards some fresher air. Bemused, they stood and watched the bizarre spectacle of the scraggy old woman with the broken glasses screeching ineptly, whacking her son with her stick. It appeared he had no intention of getting got, but just sat there looking utterly broken and bawled his heart out. Whatever it was that had happened to these people for them to end up in such a state, Finton couldn't imagine, but it must have been pretty extreme. It was at this already sight At this already slightly strange moment, a massive orange and white helicopter roared close overhead. Astonished, Gribbly took off his big jungle hat and waved it furiously. Finton followed suit. Eric, however, continued crying, and Edith continued hitting him. Inside the police rescue helicopter, which had been following the course of the river, one of the crew caught a glimpse of what looked like a group of figures on the ground. There weren't quite as many as they'd expected to find, and they were in the wrong place, but he was sure he'd seen something. He left his post and urgently alerted the pilot. A brief discussion followed with the navigator, who said they hadn't yet reached the coordinates they'd been given, so he must be mistaken. The spotter, however, insisted he'd definitely seen people down there and managed to persuade the pilot to circle back round and double check. Sure enough, standing in the small muddy clearing by the merging rivers was a handful of people. The whole crew saw them this time. Two of the figures on the ground were madly waving their hats to get their attention, while a third had kneeled over on his side, apparently injured, and was being assisted by a fourth. This must be them. The pilot brought the helicopter as low as he could over the clearing and hovered above them. The door in its side slid open, and a rescue line with a leather harness was winched down. Finton looked at Gribbly, broke into a massive grin. "Brilliant," he shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Now that's what I call a real stroke of luck." Two helmeted crewmen in the dark green jumpsuits descended next and began organising the rescue operation. One went over to assist the poor injured man lying on the ground, while the other tried to establish that they'd found the right people. "You Gonzales?" he hollered to Gribbly, who couldn't hear a thing he was saying over the noise of the helicopter. "Pardon?" he shouted back, cupping a hand to his ear. "Gonzales? You Gonzales, yes?" he repeated. Finton couldn't hear him either, but gave his rescuer a big smile and a double thumbs up anyway. The man turned his attention to Finton. "You wrench?" he said hopefully. "On what?" said Finton, thoroughly confused. "On winch?" Suddenly the proverbial penny dropped. "Oh, I see what you mean," he went on, nodding vigorously. "You want to winch us up? Winch, okay, comprendo." This seemed to satisfy some of the man's doubts. Where's the others, please?" he yelled, looking around for the missing 18 people. "Others? What others?" said Finton, turning to a self-deafened Gribbly for help and not getting any. 22 people, continued the rescuer, holding up his fingers several times to aid communication. 22? That obviously wasn't right. Finton thought he'd better put the poor, confused foreign man straight. No, not 22, just 2, see? Me and Gribbs, he shouted, pointing helpfully between Gribbly and himself. Oh, and there's those people over there, I suppose. He added as an afterthought, pointing towards Eric and Edith, who were having an equally pointless conversation with the paramedic. We don't actually know them. They're kidnappers, you see, and they smell a bit. He held his nose and pulled a face to demonstrate the fact. The man looked puzzled. Kidnappers? He said. Yeah, you know, kidnappers, baddies, criminals. Despite the deafening noise from the helicopter overhead and the serious language barrier, the words seemed to translate perfectly. Well, criminals, he repeated, suddenly looking very interested. Finton nodded again and made an unpleasant face indicated how much he didn't trust them. The news seemed to change the dynamics of the situation completely. The man strode directly over to his paramedic companion, took a good, hard look at the foul-smelling wild people, then yelled something urgent. Together they stepped back and began speaking into the little microphones in their helmets. Messages were exchanged with the rest of the helicopter crew, causing two more men, equipped with large, scary-looking guns, to descend hurriedly to the ground. It was all getting really exciting. Finton, who only a few minutes before had been feeling horribly despondent, was now having a fabulous time. It was like being in a movie. Without hesitation, the two armed policemen levelled their guns at the bombsteads and shouted warnings in Portuguese. Edith dropped her stick, abandoned her son, and attempted to make a run for it. She'd only hobbled a few steps when she was grabbed, pushed to the ground, and handcuffed. As was Eric, who was feeling far too miserable to put up any resistance, other than the smell, of course, which had been causing the men a little hesitation. By this point, Finton was so excited he'd even managed to forget how hungry he was. With the fugitives safely restrained, all four of the men turned to Finton and Gribbly, warmly shook them by the hand and congratulated them on their brilliant work. Oh, it was nothing, said Finton with complete honesty, while somehow managing to sound fabulously modest. Having donned their rucksacks, the brave crime-fighting heroes were helped into the harness and lifted into the waiting helicopter, where the other crew members also offered their congratulations. The navigator pointed happily to a police wanted poster stuck to the inside of the open hatchway. It seemed an odd coincidence, but it was a photo-fit picture of the smelly pair being restrained below. Finton and Gribbly exchanged smiles of relief, tinged with a tiny bit of pride. Not only had they just been rescued from a terrible fate, but they had apparently captured Brazil's most wanted criminals too. The day wasn't turning out so badly after all. Gonzalez's day, on the other hand, had ended up being a big disappointment. Several hours had passed and there was still no sign of the rescue helicopter. He wondered where it could have got to. The men were getting restless, hungry and thirsty and had started arguing with each other. Scuffles broke out when someone found half a burnt meat pie that had survived the exploding hut. Max Wrench, meanwhile, was hopelessly delirious. All day long he wandered around annoying the men by asking them if they'd seen Barbara. Several times they had to restrain him to stop him wandering off into the forest in search of his hotel. Gonzalez tried calling for help again and again but got no answer. By the time darkness fell, everyone was in a foul mood. Eventually, the following afternoon, after many attempts and much swearing, he got a signal on the satellite phone. The emergency services, however, were confused. "What?" said the woman on the end of the line. "But we rescued you yesterday. Are you lost again already?" Gonzalez was stunned. "No, you didn't," he yelled. "We're still sitting here, waiting for you." "Well, not according to my records you aren't," continued the woman, consulting a written report on her desk. It was at this point that Gonzalez completely lost his temper and said a few unwise and unhelpful things. She hung up. It took another call and nearly half an hour of apologies before the emergency services agreed to send out another rescue helicopter. "Has anyone seen Barbara?" said Wrench to a tree and wandered off into the forest again. Oh dear. Right, chapter 30. Despite the cold, the drizzle and the grey skies, Finton was happy to be back in England. It had been a long, tiring return journey, but at least he and Gribbly had been spared the ocean crossing this time and taken a plane. Since his brilliant helicopter ride, Finton had been cured of his fear of flying and was now something of a convert to the joys of air travel, which was lucky, as all the Atlantic cruise line companies had refused to let him on board. The only problem now was the big black car they'd borrowed was still parked at the Southampton docks. Many miles away from the airport they arrived at. Consequently, one train and 2 buses later, Finton and Gribbly found themselves sitting in the back of a taxi, contentedly watching the scenery pass by. After all the danger and excitement of the past couple of weeks, everything seemed wonderfully normal. The taxi pulled up into the driveway of Fedora Hall and dropped them right outside the house. They were just hauling their battered mud-caked luggage out of the boot when Finton's father appeared at the front door. "Ah, so the Wanderer's return, eh?" he said, smiling through his huge moustache. "All's well, I hope." "Hello, Dad," said Finton, not sure whether he should shake his hand or hug him. He awkwardly tried a bit of both. "All fine, thanks. Glad to be home." Sir Filbert took Gribbly's hand and thanked him for escorting his difficult youngest son, which was a job well beyond the call of normal duty. "Behaved himself, did he, the boy?" he asked. "Most of the time, sir, yes," said Gribbly diplomatically. Between them they gathered up the pile of rucksacks and dirty boots and carried them into the hall. Flavian and Felicity, the annoying elder siblings, appeared and immediately resumed their favourite sport of Finton baiting. "Good grief," said Felicity. "Little brother's back. Thought we'd seen the last of you." "Crikey, so he is," added Flavian in mock amazement. "Been camping in the front garden all this time, have we?" The pair of them high-fived each other and snorted with laughter. They seemed to find this hilarious. "Oh, ha ha," scowled Finton, who was then smothered by the sudden arrival of his mother. "Oh, look, it's my brave little explorer," she cooed, giving him a big wet kiss on the cheek. "Home all safe and sound. I've been ever so worried." "Mum," he protested, "I'm not little." His irritating siblings found this highly amusing too. Any detailed reporting of his epic adventure, however, had to wait until Finton had washed his hands and his mother had spread a few sheets of newspaper on the sofa for him to sit on. "So," began Mr. Filbert, clapping his hands together expectantly as the whole family gathered in the drawing room, "how was this big trek?" Gribbly gestured for Finton to be the bearer of the good news. "Well," he said, It was brilliant, actually, a complete success. What? Said Felicity. You mean you didn't get lost as soon as you got outside the gates? Oh, I don't believe it. There's always a first time for everything, added Flavian, guffawing at his own wit. Now then, you two, chastised their mother. Let your little brother tell his story. Finton frowned. It seemed nothing at all had changed. No one had taken him seriously before the expedition, and they weren't taking him any more seriously now. He decided to skip all the exciting details, the tales of hardship, pain, suffering, amazing discoveries and even more amazing coincidences, and cut straight to the grand unveiling of his treasure. All right then, he announced defiantly. Take a look at this. He unzipped his dirty rucksack, which his mother had insisted be placed on several sheets of newspaper to protect the carpet, and pulled out a small plastic box. The family looked intrigued and leaned forward in their seats to see what he'd brought back. Biting his lip in anticipation, Finton proudly peeled off the airtight lid, lifted out the crumpled paper parcel, and carefully placed it on the coffee table. Oh, said his mother. What is it? It's nothing nasty, is it? This, mother, announced Finton dramatically, is the rarest, most precious and most delicious fruit in the entire world. With great ceremony, using only his fingertips, he gently unwrapped the parcel. Prepare yourselves for nothing less than the legendary Great Brazilian Choco. He froze in mid-sentence. Plonked in the middle of the family coffee table on a page torn from his Young Adventurer magazine were the sad remains of a stale peanut butter sandwich cut into neat little squares. Bit funny looking, isn't it? Said his father, peering at it in faint disgust. Finton turned to Gribbly and gaped in horror. Where's it gone? He squeaked, losing all control over his voice. Where's it gone, Gribbs? What's happened? Flavian and Felicity instigated a sarcastic round of applause and made more unfunny remarks which Finton didn't hear. His mind was elsewhere. You know what this means, don't you? He muttered to Gribbly as all the colour drained from his face. I ate it, didn't I? I didn't eat the sandwich, I ate the choco plum. It would certainly appear so, sir, said Gribbly sympathetically. Most unfortunate. However, not to worry. I fortunately took the precaution of bringing along a spare one in case of accidents. As Finton sat, white-faced and open-mouthed, gaping like a very ill fish, Gribbly produced a small, carefully wrapped container from his bag and handed it over. You can show them this one instead if you like, sir. Sir Filbert was especially impressed. This thing wasn't even supposed to exist outside of legend and Daft Boys adventure stories, and yet there it was in real life, reddish-brown and beautifully shiny and sitting on his coffee table. Well, I never! The Brazilian choco plum. Who'd have thought it? He said, coming closer for a better look. Well done, young man. I honestly didn't think you had it in you. This was the closest thing to a compliment Finton could ever remember hearing from his father. Well, Gribbly did a lot of the work, he said, but glowed with pride anyway. Are you sure you're allowed to bring it into the country? Said Flavian, who was desperately trying to think of something to find fault with. Weren't you supposed to declare it at customs? Finton shrugged and paid no attention. So you only got the one then, did you? Is that all you could manage? Added Felicity sarcastically, and received a very stern look from her mother. Finton ignored them both. He wasn't going to let his obnoxious brother and sister spoil this moment. Any idea what it tastes like? Asked Sir Filbert, slowly coming to terms with the choco plum's potentially huge commercial value. Not really, said Finton, and exchanged a guilty glance with Gribbly. It was true, though. The only memory he had of his sleep-eating incident was that he had woken up feeling very full and very happy. We'll have to try it. Gribbly was dispatched to the kitchen and returned with china plates, tiny silver forks and a very sharp knife, and with the choco plum centred on a large platter. With great care and precision, he carved the fruit into thin slices and distributed them among the family. Beneath the fuzzy brown skin lay a beautiful pale yellow pulp and a single smooth black stone. The taste was extraordinary, a fabulous mix of the warm creaminess of chocolate and the sweet juiciness of a plum, yet not really quite like either, a completely new and unique flavour. Everyone was unbelievably impressed. Even Felicity and Flavian found themselves being complimentary. If they could grow this fruit in their greenhouse, it would mean a secure future for Fedora fancies, possibly even a fortune in extra sales. Finton was suddenly looking like a vital member of the beloved family business. Last chapter, chapter 31. 3 weeks passed. Back in Brazil, a seriously traumatised Gonzales had decided to take an early retirement. His recent unpleasant encounters with fire, water, piranhas, biting ants, exploding helicopters and dogweed had been enough to put him off the business world for good. In search of a far simpler life, he had moved into a small, isolated hut with no electricity or flushing toilets. There he spent his days tending his meagre vegetable garden and trying to stop his hands trembling. Every day he counted his blessings that he never had to see Finton Fedora again. He may have been utterly penniless, but at least he was safe. Meanwhile, the Brazilian authorities had wasted no time in finding Eric and Edith Bumstead guilty of a long string of offences and locked them away. Despite daily hot showers to ensure they didn't upset their fellow prisoners, there was soon enough complaints about the revolting pair to have them removed. A brief court hearing deported them back to England, where they were split up and put in separate prisons. Edith found herself sharing a cell with some women who were unbelievably even nastier than she was. This at least gave her plenty to moan about. Eric, meanwhile, had sunk even deeper into despondency. All his dreams of gold-plated taps in the shape of swans had come to nothing. All he had now was a mouldy, lukewarm shower, which he had to share with several other horrible, hairy inmates. His life was nothing but boredom and misery. To make things even worse, he had ended up in the same prison as his long-lost father, Nosha Bumstead, the notorious armed robber, who had read all about his son's exploits in the newspapers. He wasn't proud, having a fat, useless, failed kidnapper as a son was ruining his reputation. It wasn't a happy family reunion. A different sort of reputation had also been ruined at Gigante Foods International. Randall's handling of the Brazilian business had cost the company a fortune. Sales of their cake products had plummeted and many jobs had been lost. Not Randall's, because he was the boss and got to decide whose jobs disappeared. This, of course, made him even less popular. His name had become a joke in the food business. He was the idiot who made a multi-million-dollar fuss about something that he didn't have, and probably didn't even exist. Even in his own office building, people sniggered as he passed in the corridors and whispered things like, "There goes the Chuckle Plum King." As a result of all this, Randall had taken to spending long periods of the day locked in the toilet whimpering. The only thing that gave him any consolation at all was the knowledge that no one else had the Choco Plums either. That would have finished him off for good. There had also been big changes in the world of Max Wrench. He was a changed man. The vicious, ruthless businessman had disappeared and been replaced by a softer, more timid, more understanding man. This new Wrench, now that he was unemployed and freed from the corrupting world of big business, enjoyed nothing more than helping his wife Barbara around the house. His days revolved around cleaning, washing up, walking the poodle, and listening to her irritating voice telling him what a loser he was. Occasionally, in the middle of the night, he would have little flashes of memory involving a strange, annoying boy. For some reason, these flashbacks left him wide awake, sweaty and twitching. Other than that, he remembered nothing, and had miraculously become almost pleasant. Perhaps there was something therapeutic about being hit over the head with a heavy iron cooking pot. Meanwhile, back at Fedora Hall, Gribley's life had very quickly returned to normal, back to good old basic domestic duties. His days were all very much the same, dull, predictable and hard work, which oddly enough was exactly how he liked it. Being employed to look after Finton always seemed to swing wildly between long periods of safe, boring familiarity and shorter phases of wild, dangerous madness. Not that he wasn't secretly fond of a little excitement, but on the whole he much preferred the boring bits. Every evening, after finishing the ironing, he would reward himself with a long leisurely soak in the bath, reading a good book. There he lay perfectly content and happy with his lot in life. On the soap tray in front of him, he had arranged a cup of tea in a china cup and two triangular slices of buttered toast with the finest English honey. Luxury. Until there was a little knock on the bathroom door. "Gribbs," "Are you in there?" called Finton's voice from the landing. Gribbly made a vague noise, which sort of acknowledged he was there but would ideally rather be left in peace. "It's me," said Finton, accidentally bumping into a vase and sending it crashing to the floor, just in case there might be some doubt. It would be nice to report that Finton had returned from the rainforest older, wiser and less of a disaster, but this wouldn't be entirely true. Admittedly, he was 3 weeks older, but there was still no sign of any wisdom and little evidence of him growing out of his unfortunate clumsiness. On the plus side, though, his father now took him a little bit more seriously and was even wavering on his decision to ban him from the family business. Felicity and Flavian were incredibly annoyed at this prospect. They even found themselves grudgingly accepting that their little brother had achieved something pretty important, especially since there had been little signs of life in the greenhouse. "I've got some good news," continued Finton. "Well, 2 bits of good news, actually. Mum just told me the choco plum tree has sprouted. She says it looks really, really healthy and is growing fast. Brilliant, eh?" This was great news. Finton had been feeling extremely guilty for what had happened in the jungle. He had already written 6 letters of apology to Corentina and Anna, sent them some money for a new boat, and was now looking forward to being able to send them cuttings of the plant too. Hopefully it could be arranged that the grove was replanted one day, only this time he wouldn't be telling anyone, especially not ambitious employees of Gigantic Foods International. "That is indeed excellent news, sir. Many congratulations," said Gribbly, hoping to be left to his tea and his reading. "I look forward to seeing it soon." "Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait till it starts growing little baby choco plums," added Finton from the other side of the closed door. "Oh, and one other thing. I hope you've got some warm clothes in your wardrobe, Gribbs, because I've just been reading a brilliant new article in Young Adventurers magazine. It's all about these totally rare fruits called Icelandic snowberries." Gribbly slid further into his bathwater so that it covered his ears and draped a warm flannel over his eyes. He just wanted to make the safe, boring phase last a little bit longer. And there we have it. All's well that ends well for Finton Fedora, the world's worst explorer. And the bad guys got their just desserts, didn't they? They got what they deserved. They reaped what they sowed. Some brilliant characters in that story. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And I shall speak to you soon. Till next time.